morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along. Great pleasure this morning for me to introduce our speaker, Peter Williamson. He's the BBC Radio Shropshire astronomer, as some of you may know. He's going to take us through the start of the space race right up to the Apollo 17 landing. Everything else I'll leave to Peter because it's rather a lot. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, yes, start of the space. Well, I'm actually going to go from the formation of the moon because it's useful to know how the moon got there, isn't it, really? I mean, without it, we couldn't have landed on it. And I'm taking you up to Apollo 11, not Apollo 17. If I took you up to Apollo 17, you'll be here till Christmas. Yeah, so just a little bit of an introduction of what I do. I'm a Fawkes Telescope consultant. This is an educational network. We supply telescopes across the world. These are large observatory telescopes, not small telescopes. These are £17 million telescopes. And we supply these to schools for free to use in the classroom. It's a service that was set up quite a long time ago by a guy called Bill Fawkes in Cardiff through his wealth at it, which is very kind of him. And now we can supply this network of telescopes based in Australia, Hawaii, around the world for children in the classroom to use. It's a free service. No school has to pay a penny to use these. I'm also, I don't know if you've heard me on Eye on the Sky. Has anybody done that? No, good, that's why you're still here. And I also, with my family, run an Astro Radio, which is an astronomical and music radio station. And we also run an astronomical and music festival in Bulthwells every year, where we have people from Sky at Night doing lectures, we have astronomers there to answer questions, and we have music as well, so it all kind of intermingles. And when I've got some spare time, I work for Cardiff University in the astrophysics department doing research on different objects and then making these into learning materials for schools. So that's a little bit of what I do when I'm not doing this. So this year is the 50th anniversary of the moon landings. I've got to ask this question, and I always ask it. Is there anybody in here who doesn't believe they went to the moon? Because there's the exit. Also, yeah, and it's nice because when I go in to do this in schools and I say, does anybody remember the moon landing? Even the teachers go, well, I wasn't born. But I've got a feeling most of you remember the moon landings. Is anybody that doesn't? No? Great. So 50th anniversary. So we'll take a step back in time. And a step back in time is, how did the moon get there? Well, the sun there, after the sun's formation, there was a lot of rock, gas and dust left over in these disks, and this is called an accretion disk. And in space, it doesn't happen on Earth, but in space, particles of gas and dust and rock combine together over millions of years to form the planets and the moons. And our Earth originally was called Gaia. This is the impact theory of how the moon was formed. This is Gaia, and this is an object called Theia, about the size of Mars, and it gave a glancing blow to Gaia, and they combined to form the Earth. And then that's happened 4.5 billion years ago. It didn't happen yesterday. And what rock was left over started to orbit the Earth, and that eventually coalesced and combined into the moon. Originally 2 moons, we think, and then those combined into 1 moon, the moon we see today. So it had rings, the Earth had rings around it that looked pretty much like Saturn at the time. That's the size of the Earth, and that's the size of the moon to the Earth. As you can see, it's significantly smaller. Has anybody got a telescope? Anybody go out and look at the moon? Yeah? Yeah, it's always an interesting object to look at. So we've now got the moon, we've got the moon formed. So there was myths and legends around that, and one of the greatest legends I like is one of the Mayan legends, is that every time there was an eclipse of the moon, they would sacrifice their leader. So they can't... I think this is a good idea. I think we could do with that myth today. So what they did, they cottoned on to this. This is not a good idea, we're losing a lot of leaders. So what they used to do is he would be deselected just before the eclipse of the moon, they would elect a peasant, sacrifice him, and then re-elect the leader afterwards. It wasn't really fair, was it? But, you know, it's kind of what's life like it is now, really. And, of course, we also worshipped the planets and the moon and the sun, probably from places like Stonehenge. Anybody been to Stonehenge? Anybody think it's going to be better when it's finished? But yes, we worship the moon, and I think it was also used as an astronomical calendar to know when to plant crops and when not to plant crops. So that was, some of the stones do align with the rising of the moon and the rising of the sun at certain times of the year. Also, there's a myth that there are madness around full moons, but there's kind of some evidence to that. I've done the talk to different groups, and there's been nurses and people from accident and emergency units, and said they tend to have more problems around a full moon. I can't see how, because it's only light. The moon's always there. It doesn't change in shape or size. It's only the light shining on it. So maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. The other thing that the moon does for us, it keeps the Earth at a tilt. We rotate on a tilt. So when the northern hemisphere is facing towards the sun, in its tilt, in its orbit, we get summer. And when the northern hemisphere is facing away from the sun, in the winter, it's colder. So if the moon wasn't there, we wouldn't get seasons and we wouldn't get tides. So we got the moon to be thankful for that. So when it's cold this winter, just blame the moon. And also for the floods on Frankwell Car Park. So that's how that works. You can see that we're tilted towards the northern hemisphere, tilted towards the sun in the summer, and when it's around the other side of the sun, we're tilted away. So it keeps, the sun doesn't rise so high in the sky. Also, there's a myth about the far side and the dark side of the moon. There is no dark side of the moon. There's a far side, there is no dark side. Because the moon orbits around the Earth. So when the moon is at this point in its orbit, the sun is shining on the far side. We can't see our side because it's dark, but the sun shines on the far side. So there is no dark side of the moon. There is only a far side of the moon. So we come a little bit further forward, and the first telescope was invented in 1608 by Hans Lippershey, and the first person to actually look at the moon through a telescope was Galileo in 1611, and that's one of his first drawings. I don't think it's that accurate, but being as it's 1611 and through a very, very crude telescope, I think it's not bad. First photograph ever taken of the moon was in 1840, and that was taken by Draper, and that appeared in the New York Times. And to be honest, a lot of amateurs are still not taking photographs as good as that now, and that was taken in 1840. But we take a big step forward. We take a big step forward to rocketry, and of course the development of rocketry started in 1933 in Germany by Werner von Braun back in Germany. But with the rise of the Nazi Party, they stole his research and forced him to make rockets that would be used as weapons and not scientific objects, as you can see there. Has anybody seen the V2 rocket at the museum? I can never remember the name of it.
Cosford.
Yeah, there's a V2, but I think it's on its side. I don't think it's actually being stood up. But when they actually liberated Peenemünde and occupied it, they found research where Werner von Braun was actually planning to put man on the moon. And I think if the Germans hadn't have been defeated like they were, they would have been the first people to put man on the moon. They were on track to do it. But obviously they wanted it as a weapon of war and not of science. And the first ever photograph close to orbit was taken by a V2, and we can clearly see here that the Earth is not flat. No flat earthers. No. Good. So we can clearly see the Earth is not flat, and that was one of the first ever pictures taken from high altitude of the Earth. After the war, when Peenemünde was liberated, Russia took 15,000 space scientists or rocketry scientists back to Russia by force to go back and work on the Russian space program. And this was the guy, Helmut Gertrup, who led that Russian space program. Werner von Braun here had an option. He could go back to the United States, or he could be tried for war crimes. He chose to go back to the United States and help them with their research. Then on 4th of October, everything changed, 1957, Sputnik. Does anybody actually remember Sputnik? You do? I don't, I was born. That changed everything. The Russians had launched this little bleeping ball into orbit, and it put panic into nations across the globe that the Russians could actually do this. And they'd taken that one major step forward. The Americans still couldn't get a rocket to launch at this point. And on September 1959, 14th of September, Russia successfully had a probe impact the moon. They'd gone from launching a probe into Earth orbit to actually impacting a probe on the moon. It wasn't like we do today, where you launch a probe and it lands successfully. It was like throwing a golf ball at another ball and hoping that it would hit. And obviously, because it's called Lunar 2, it's obvious what happened to Lunar 1, it missed. Totally. And that was the first ever picture of the lunar surface from a probe in orbit and about to impact on the moon. That was one of the photographs as it was coming down to the lunar surface to impact. So that was quite an achievement. So we now knew that we could get to the moon, although it was the Russians that were developing that technology. And then on 4th of October 1959, the Russians went one step further forward and launched a probe to the far side of the moon. This is the actual photograph, but they slipped up. It hadn't long been invented, but fax transmission. And they transmitted the signal back by fax. But we were facing the probe when it transmitted the signal back, not the Russians. And it came out at Jodrell Bank on a fax machine, hadn't got a clue what it was, realised what it was, forwarded it to Times newspaper and Guardian. Also, it appeared on the BBC Sky at night before the Russians even saw it. And I think it miffed them a little bit. So we pinched their achievement. They put the technology up there, we saw it first. Not a great picture, but you think about it, it's 1959, we haven't even launched a man into space yet, and we're seeing the far side of the moon. Then, 12th of April, 1961, Yuri Gagarin. The Russians had done it. They put a man into orbit. He orbited once around the Earth and successfully landed again and became a world hero. And I think it was quite an achievement because nobody had gone there before. He didn't know what to expect. They didn't know what to expect, but he managed to do it. The Americans at that point began to panic. We're really getting left behind in the space race now. So they put an advert out. Now, where would you put an advert out for an astronaut? So they put it in the newspaper, and I've seen the newspaper cutting. There's one of them in the Leicester Space Museum where it's got plumbers, electricians, and astronauts. And these guys applied. And when they applied to become astronauts, not to arouse suspicion, they were told to turn up at a particular hotel and all book in under the same name. Now, to me, that would have aroused suspicion. But there's one guy in this group here. Anybody know who that is? Neil Armstrong. The only guy in that group to fail the entrance test. But somebody saw something in him and let him retake it, and he passed. At this point, this is where Neil's life started to change. At this point, his daughter had got terminal cancer. She was on chemotherapy, and he said if she survived through the chemotherapy, he wouldn't have taken up the option to be an astronaut. He would have carried on at doing his test pilot work back where he was at the Air Force Base. But sadly, his daughter died, and he took the option then to go to NASA and become an astronaut. Now, a lot of the stories I'm relating here are related to me through a friend of mine. A friend of mine is Rick Armstrong, Neil Armstrong's son. And he's given me a lot of family stories that didn't often appear in the press. And so Neil then decided to go to NASA and take up the opportunity to be an astronaut with the rest of the guys. And at that point, the president at the time, Kennedy, made a speech. He said, "We're going to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon, and we choose to do the other things. First of all, NASA had no idea how to put a man on the moon. They hadn't even got the technology to get a man into space properly yet, and he's challenged them to go to the moon. Also, I'm still trying to work out what these other things were that he said about, because he said, we will do the other things. What were they? Could have been anything. But they had to get down and buckle down and carry on with the challenge. And the first successful landing on the moon by the Americans was Surveyor 3. Surveyor 2 and Surveyor 1 landed on the moon, impacted, but they didn't transmit back. Surveyor 3 did, and you're probably thinking, how do we get a picture of Surveyor 3 on the moon? Well, it came back. Apollo 12 landed nearby, and they took photographs of Surveyor 3. So that was the first test that we could actually land on the moon safely and start to take photographs. This was the first ever live television transmission from the surface of the moon. Doesn't look great, but when you think again how far back it was 1967. But when you look at this, 1967, we're only 2 years away from landing a man on the moon. Next project was to put a man in orbit and work out how to dock with another object, because when the Apollo astronauts went up, the Lunar Module goes up, the command module goes up, and it has to dock with one of the stages and pull the Lunar Module out the stage, so they needed to work out how to do this. So, two guys, this is where fate again played a hand for Neil Armstrong. The two guys that were actually picked to do this were flying in on the morning to launch to do this, and their aircraft hit the hangar and they died. There was a backup crew, Neil Armstrong and David Scott, so they got to go and do this mission in Gemini 8. This is what Gemini 8 looks like, a very intimate little spacecraft. You can imagine being stuck in that for a few days or a few hours with your friends. Not great, not a lot of room in these spacecrafts, but that's the only technology we got at the time. They had to dock with this module here, the Agena rocket. Neil Armstrong managed to dock with the Agena rocket. As he docked, the spacecraft started to spin, and it was spinning faster and faster and faster, up to the point of about 2 rotations every second. And he thought, the reason we're rotating and spinning is the Agena rocket has put us out of balance. So he undocked, and the spin started to go faster. David Scott at this point had passed out because of G-forces. If Neil Armstrong had passed out at this point, they would never have come back. But he managed not only to operate the switches, because if you think about it, he's blacking out and he's trying to operate switches. It's all done manually. He also worked out that it must have been one of the retro rockets on the re-entry that had stuck. So he managed to fire the other one to balance it. He had the presence of mind to do that while rotating and blacking out. This is where they started to realise this is the man we're going to send. But still, he was only picked for the backup crew. Next project was to be able to walk in space. And they sent Ed White up. He successfully left the spacecraft, and then he had a problem. He started to spin. And they had to go back to the drawing board. How are we going to keep balance when we're moving around a spacecraft outside? We think of it as a standard kind of way of doing things. We think this is so obvious. But Buzz Aldrin worked out if we put rails on the side of the spacecraft, we can hold on to them. And that's what they did. It's a little bit, I don't know if you know the story of the Americans trying to develop a pen that writes in zero gravity. Yeah, they tried to develop a pen that writes in zero gravity. They put a lot of money into the research on the space station, and when they were up there trying to work if this pen would work, a Russian handed them a pencil. The command centre ready to launch Apollo was built, and this Apollo centre probably has less computing power than a modern iPad. But at the time, that was state of the art. And we came to the point where they were going to do tests and launch Apollo 1. Apollo 1 was just going to launch the command module into orbit to test that it could orbit the Earth. These were the guys, but disaster happened. They cut corners on the production of the module, and this fella here, Gus Grissom, had voiced an opinion, and he actually put a lame duck on the top of the command module saying, this is not going to fly. They got inside the capsule to test the capsule. As they got inside the capsule, it was a pure oxygen atmosphere. The cables and the electrics weren't tested, so anything could happen. They got inside, it had a door that only opened from the outside. They couldn't open it from the inside, so a lot of design faults. They got into the capsule to test it. There was a short circuit on one of the cables. Pure oxygen, ignited, they died, they couldn't get out. The sad thing is, and I've spoken to the guy that heard this, he said he had to sit for 30 seconds and on the intercom listen to these guys dying. He said it was horrendous. So Gus Grissom, Ed White and Roger Chaffee, RIP. It's put the Apollo program back a long, long way as well, because now NASA was saying we need more money to redevelop. The government was saying at the time, we haven't got the money and we don't think we should pursue this now with the deaths of the astronauts. But they then decided at Apollo 4 to pick up at Apollo 4, and they launched the first Saturn V rocket, a test, nobody in it. It was just a test to launch, they could launch the Saturn V. The next mission was Apollo 7, where they launched the command module into space, and that was Eisel, Shearer and Cunningham. And they tested the command module in orbit. This is the command module. This little bit here, this is all the rocketry, but this is the little bit where the astronauts are. And that's what it looks like inside the command module. It's a little bit cramped. The facilities aren't great, if you can imagine. And one of the things that you've got to remember is when you're in space, you can't open a window to let any fresh air in. What's in there stays in there till you come back. On Apollo 8, Lovell threw up at launch. That stayed all the way to the moon and all the way back, floating around the command module. So does anybody want to be an astronaut? I always say this to the kids, I say, do you want to be an astronaut? At the beginning they go, yes, yes, yes. And you go through the bit where the astronauts died and the bit where, you know, the facilities aren't great. And this one little lad put up, he said, I don't mind dying because I die happy. I said, not really. That was what the control panel looked like in the command module. Again, more power in an iPad. And the Saturn V rocket, still the biggest rocket ever built. And I don't know if anybody of you are as sad as me, but I have the Lego version. It stands about that high, and it's got 1,969 pieces. 1969, see? So that's the Saturn V rocket, 363 feet high, 33 feet in diameter, 3 stages, first test flight, 1967. Then we come to Apollo 8. Now this is a historic mission, probably more so really than Apollo 11 if you think about it. We've only tested the Saturn V without anybody in it. Apollo 4 tested the Saturn V rocket. Up until this point, it had never launched with men in it. This mission not only launched the Saturn V to put men into space, it also took them to the moon for the first time as well, because they orbited the moon. So it's quite a daring mission. And these were the guys, Lovell, Anders and Borman. Now, Jim Lovell had to be the most unlucky astronaut in the history of the Apollo program. Why? Because he didn't get to land on the moon on this mission because it just went round, and he was also the commander of Apollo 13 that never landed on the moon. So his dream was to land on the moon, and he never got to do it. But Apollo 8 orbited the Earth, and this was probably one of the most iconic pictures of the time, the Earth rising above the moon. They didn't expect to see this. They didn't expect to see this happen. And when that happened on Christmas Eve in 1968, it took the world by storm. It was an amazing photograph. And Lovell put his thumb up and put it over the Earth, and he said, I've just blanked out the whole of humanity. Everything I know is behind my thumb. And if you think about it, at that point in time, everybody was in that photograph that was on the Earth at the time, except for 3 men. They were in the spaceship. it's worth thinking about, isn't it? It's a daunting thing. They also, at this point, they had to make a statement. And they said, what are you going to quote? What are you going to quote from? And they decided to quote from Genesis, from the Bible. And that got them into a lot of trouble, because when they got back, a lot of other religions around the earth said, why did it not reflect our religion? So NASA made a decision at this point. Any missions they launch into space never has religion brought into any of the speeches, because it has to be for all mankind. Needed to land on the moon. So they had to develop the Lunar Module, the Lunar Module landing vehicle, and this was the test vehicle called the Flying Bedstead. Pretty much like what you get in the NHS now. That's why we need more funding. But yeah, the Flying Bedstead, and it was a horrible spacecraft. Neil Armstrong was saying at the time it was a horrible craft to try and control. And this is one of the times when Neil Armstrong was flying, and it exploded and crashed, and he ejected feet from the ground. And this is one of the nice stories his son told me. He said he ejected out of that, because we now realise that Neil Armstrong was quite a cool character. He could survive under pressure. He ejected out of that vehicle, landed, bruised himself a little bit, and he said he went home, and his wife said, have you had a good day? And he said, yeah, not too bad. He sat down and had his tea, as if nothing had happened. But it came to this was all done for the development of this vehicle, the Lunar Module. Now I think, myself, it's a thing of beauty, but some people think it's an ugly looking thing. But it could only work in a vacuum. You could actually poke your finger through the side of that, it's so thin. It had to be extremely thin, it had to be extremely light, so it would only work in a vacuum. First test of the Lunar Module was by Schweikart, Scott, who was on the mission on Gemini 8 with Neil Armstrong, and McDivitt. They tested the Lunar Module in Earth orbit, and it tested out fine, so they were quite happy with it. So they decided, now we're going to test it in lunar orbit, which was Apollo 10. Again, this was the most untrusted crew ever on the Apollo missions. Why? Because this had to come in with within feet of landing on the lunar surface. Now, if it was you, and you were commanding that, and you were in feet of the lunar surface to test it, would you have gone that extra bit and landed? Would you have done it? Nobody. I would. And that was Cernan, Stafford, and Young. And Apollo 10 launched the Lunar Module into lunar orbit, launched in May the 18th, 1969, so we're not far from the lunar landing itself. Entered lunar orbit 21st of May 1969 and left lunar orbit on May the 24th. Splashed down on May the 26th. The command module was called Charlie Brown. The Lunar Module was called Snoopy. Now Snoopy's still out there, and we think we found it. It's in an elongated orbit between the Earth and the Moon, and we think we found it, but trying to get it back as a historical museum piece would be impossible, but it is still out there. And they came with 550,000 feet from the lunar surface. And how did they stop them landing? How would you think? They made it sure that it was short of fuel, so they couldn't do it. I think that was cruel. At the time, the Russians were developing a thing called the M1 super booster, and it's only recently been found out. A friend of mine has been doing research out at Space City in Russia, and they had one of these on the launch pad 3 days before Saturn V launched to the moon, to launch their own crew to the moon. But it failed, and so they didn't go to the moon. If they'd have succeeded, if that craft had launched on that date, they would have been 3 days before the Americans. Because it failed, then they made light of it and told the world they never intended to go to the moon. Their eyes were on space stations. They wouldn't have said that if they'd have got that N1 to launch. And that was the N1 sitting on the launch pad 3 days before. So we come to Apollo 11. We come to the crew themselves. Neil Armstrong, mission commander, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Looking at that photograph, who do you think didn't go to the moon? Just look at Michael Collins' face. He didn't land on the moon, did he? Them two are looking quite happy. He's looking a bit miserable. But where did they go? This is a photograph I took from my back garden recently, and they landed there, Sea of Tranquility, just around there. Quite a flat area. They needed first landing to land in quite a flat area. It would be a bit hard to try and do a mountainous region mission before they'd actually successfully done this one. So breakfast, 16th of July 1969, before the launch. This always worries me. You got them looking on, well, Buzz Aldrin's looking very anxious, but he's reading a map. I would have thought they knew where they were going. But Michael Collins actually said that there was a kind of an uneasy calm in the room. He said, we were sitting there looking calm, but we didn't feel it. Because the night before, they had a mission briefing with the chief engineer, here he is, and the mission briefing stated that you have a 60% chance of not returning. Do you still want to do it? And they did. And I think if health and safety had been in operation in those days, they wouldn't have gone. But the traditional meal was steak and eggs and toast. Reason they had steak and eggs, it was high protein, so it gives energy, but it's also slow release. You've got to spend 6 days in a spaceship with other people. So that's actually the reason behind it. And after breakfast, and I always thought this was a joke, but when speaking to the astronauts, it's not a joke, it actually happened. They had to play a hand of poker. And they weren't allowed to leave that mission control for the launch craft until the commander had played a bad hand of poker. And Apollo 14 nearly missed its launch slot because they wouldn't leave. They said it's a superstition and we've got to do this. One of the other superstitions that they go through is on the way to the launch pad, they stop the vehicle that's taking them to the launch pad, and they get out and have a wee up the wheel of the spaceship. Reason behind that is Yuri Gagarin did it because he was took short on the way. So every astronaut that's ever gone into space has done this. And for the ladies, they've actually built a little toilet block with a wheel in it on the way to the launch pad. Also, 2 days before they have to plant a tree, and the day before they have to get the haircut. It's because that's the routine that Yuri Gagarin took. He was successful, and they still take that today out at Space City before there's any launch. They go through this ritual. They don the spacesuits, and they walk down to the vehicle. They have to walk past another little superstition. They walk past all the kitchen staff and pat them on the head. Another tradition. They don't do this obviously because they don't launch from the United States now, but this was one of the Apollo traditions. And also the food that's taken on the Apollo missions has to be pre-packed by the same kitchen staff that produced their breakfast. It's another superstition. They broke with that superstition once, and what mission was that? Apollo 13, believe it or not. So that's where you get the conspiracy theory, say, well, the Apollo 13, there you go, this didn't happen, that didn't happen, it's got to be all fate. They get into the launch vehicle, the transport vehicle. They have to leave a dime in the transport vehicle to say that they will return, another little superstition. And they get onto the launch vehicle and away it goes. And they said, all you can describe that is, they said, think about sitting on an interballistic missile and being hurled into space. Launched 16th of July 1969, and one of the iconic pictures is one of the stages falling back to Earth. Now we take this for granted these days when you see Elon Musk's spacecrafts dropping their boosters and they're coming back down to Earth because we've got Wi-Fi, we've got internet transmission, we've got all the rest of it. We hadn't got that then. The cameras were in these little stages here, and they were parachuted, re-entered and parachuted back to Earth, and they retrieved the film. That's how they got these pictures. No other way of doing it. And that was Destination Moon. That's what the Earth looked like as they hit the retros to head for the Moon. That was 1 day out. And they're looking back at the Earth, and that's what the Earth looked like 1 day out. And that was Michael Collins doing some checks in the command module. As you can see, it's quite a cramped little area. At this point, Buzz and Neil had gone down into the Lunar Module preparing. And there is Neil Armstrong preparing the lunar module. There was no seats in the lunar module, you had to stand up and operate it. They came into lunar orbit, and that is the first thing that they saw in lunar orbit. And there's still conspiracy theorists today say they never went to the moon, but that's a lunar base. Now I can't work out, if we never went to the moon, how can they have a lunar base as well? But there you go. So that was one of the first images they saw of the moon. So entered lunar orbit 19th of July at 1725. And that was the Earthrise that the Apollo 11 astronauts saw. Absolutely beautiful, beautiful Earthrise. But as they descended to the moon, there's a little video here, as they descended to the moon, a computer error came up, and it said, computer error, 1202. Buzz Aldrin said, we need to abort, there's a computer error. They contacted NASA, and they said, what are we going to do? There's a computer error. They said, oh, it's just a computer overflow, don't worry about it, carry on. At this point, Neil Armstrong realised that they were a little bit off target, so he took manual control. Now you might think, okay, he took manual control, he landed it. Nobody'd ever done it before. He's taken manual control of a craft to land somewhere that nobody's ever landed before, and nobody's ever flown it in those conditions. And he landed successfully with about 20 seconds of fuel left in the tank for descent. Because there's two different tanks, there's ascent and descent. Because people always say to me, well, if there's 20 seconds of fuel left, how did they get off? Two different tanks. So they landed. And the first words from the lunar surface were spoken, not by Neil Armstrong, but by Buzz Aldrin. He said, contact light. Because as it touched down, the contact light came on, and he said, contact light. So that was the first words ever spoken from the lunar surface were, contact light. And one of the other statements that were made was, there's a bunch of guys down here, I can't do a Texas accent, a bunch of guys down here going to turn blue. So that was the bunch of guys going to turn blue. They were absolutely elated that we'd managed to do it. We'd landed on the moon for the first time. And what a successful thing to do. And then we come to the immortal words. I haven't got sound on this, but let's see if it'll work. He came down the ladder, and we all know what did he say? One small step for man. He didn't. He said one small step for a man, but it's lost in transmission. I've that verified by his son as well. He said one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind, because it wouldn't have made sense otherwise, would it? And he managed to step onto the lunar surface. The other little known fact is, as he came down those steps, his grandmother was on his earpiece and said, Neil, don't get setting foot on that surface if it looks unsafe. 20 minutes later, Buzz Aldrin came down the ladder. This is one of the photographs. Now, all the photographs you'll see from the lunar surface are taken by Neil Armstrong. He had a camera fitted to his chest called a Hasselblad, and he just had to turn around and point it and press it. So he's the one that had the camera on. So all the photographs you see actually on the surface are of Buzz Aldrin. And Buzz said that was one small step for Neil, one big step for a small guy like me. And then he looked around and he said, beautiful view, magnificent desolation. One of the first footprints that were left, and that will still be there today, because there's no weather on the moon, there's no atmosphere, there's nothing to erode that. It's still there today. And that call signs, command module was Columbia. Obviously, the lunar module was Eagle. The Eagle has landed. Mementos taken to the moon were a piece of the Wright brothers' plane. I thought that was quite unique, to take a piece of wood of the Wright brothers' plane and leave it on the moon. Buzz was given a pin to take to the moon, commemorating the Apollo 1 astronauts. But Buzz Aldrin also took a camera to the moon that he shouldn't have taken. He took two things to the moon he shouldn't have taken. They weren't allowed to take mementos, unauthorized mementos, because they could bring them back and sell them. So they were told you only can take certain things. But they took Buzz Aldrin took a metal pen to the moon, which you'll see that's significant in a minute. But he also took a camera and he set it up on the side of the lunar module and stood in the photograph with him and Neil Armstrong, because NASA would have said, who took that? because there's only 2 of them on the moon. But he left it on the moon, it's still there. And this is the only photograph you'll ever see of Neil Armstrong. You'll see videos of Neil Armstrong on the moon because they could set up a TV camera. But actual photographs, this is the only one you'll see of Neil Armstrong. That's not Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong is there taking the photograph. You can see his reflection in the helmet. They had to plant the flag. We know all the conspiracy theory. The flag flapped. Of course it flapped. They were twisting it into the lunar surface. There's no atmosphere. There's nothing, so you can get near enough perpetual motion. There's nothing to resist that flapping because it's spring-loaded. So that's why they think it's a conspiracy. They think it was wind blowing it. No, it wasn't. They had to twist it into the lunar surface. First time they did it, it fell down. I still think, myself, that they should have taken the flag to represent the Earth, not the Americans. Because on the plaque it said, for all mankind, but the flag didn't represent that. They also took another flag that they didn't erect, but they laid it on the lunar surface, and that was the Samoan flag, because when they re-entered into Samoan waters. So they took the Samoan flag as well. These were some of the experiments they were putting up. That was the solar wind experiment. This was the seismic experiment, and just there, can you see that little experiment there? It was facing back towards Earth. That's the Lunar Ranger experiment, and it's still in use today. And if you've been down to Hurstman Sue Observatory in East Sussex, they fire a laser every day at the moon, and it bounces back to see how fast the moon is moving away from the Earth. It's moving about 4 centimetres a year, but it is moving away. And that's what they use that Lunar Ranger experiment for, and it fires every single day. And that's the experiment there. This was more seismic experiments that Buzz Aldrin was laying out on the surface. And I like that photograph. It's kind of, when you say magnificent desolation, don't you think it shows that? It's just nothing. And that was the plaque. Here, men from Earth, and we came in peace for all mankind. So the flag should have probably been like that rather than American flag. And I think in future they probably will be if they plant a flag again. We come to the pen, the life and death situation pen. When Buzz Aldrin re-entered the spacecraft, he broke off the ascent engine switch with his shoulder. So they had no way of firing the ascent engine to get off the moon. Got back onto NASA, NASA came up with some ideas, didn't work. Neil Armstrong came up with the idea, if we unscrew the cover off the switch and jam that metal pen between the 2 contacts, it will arm and fire the ascent engine. And that's how they got off the moon. If he hadn't got that pen with him, they'd still be there today. And you can see that pen, it's in the Smithsonian in New York. And they said it's probably the most valuable pen on the planet. So it's destination Earth, and I love that picture, the Lunar Module coming back to the command module, and you can just see the Earth peeking up above the moon there. I think that's a lovely picture. And that was a picture of actual re-entry. They're inside this fireball here. Would you like to be in there? No. It was 2,760 degrees. Now the heat shield on the command module is designed to last long enough for re-entry. It burns away as it's coming through. And it's designed just to last long enough. And as they're re-entering, because they enter what they call the blackout period, where you can't communicate with them, and they don't know they're alive until after that 3 minutes. And they go, keep asking, Apollo 11, and then eventually after 3 minutes somebody would radio back. If there's no radio back, then they fried. Next bit was, do the parachutes open? Of course, they have to open in order to splash down successfully, and this was in East Samoan Sea, and it landed on the 24th of July at 16:51. They were successfully taken out of the craft and taken into quarantine. And there was a famous bloke there, Nixon. They went into quarantine because they thought there would be bugs. They thought they were going to bring bugs back. They probably took more bugs to the moon than they brought back. But they had to stay in there for 18 days in quarantine in that little caravan. And that caravan was taken around America with them sitting in it, so they could worry about it. But here's where jobs work comes into it. And we know there's always going to be jobs worth when it comes to customs and excise. They had to fill in a customs and excise declaration and show their passports to re-enter the United States. And this is the actual document, Neil Armstrong's signature, Buzz Aldrin and Collins. They had to fill in documentation, show their passports and reason for trip. Buzz Aldrin, because he'd taken the pen and it had broken, they said, well, if you've taken it, NASA are responsible for that, and he had to fill in an expense form. And there's the expense form. I mean, this is jobs worth stuff, isn't it? But conspiracy theories say we never went. But we've recently photographed with Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, and the Chinese have photographed it. There's the descent engine that was left there. And actually, if you zoom in on that picture, you can't see it so much on there, but you can on the computer. You can actually see the experiments that they left behind from orbit. They're all there. Everything's there. You can even see the footprint. We can't actually see the individual footprints, but you can see the trails of footprints where they walked. So you show that to conspiracy theorists, and again, they'll say, well, you know, NASA made it up. And I say, well, what about the Chinese? They wouldn't make it up. They'd love to disprove it. No, they're all in league. We're all paid by NASA, apparently. I said, I'll be a millionaire. So we've got some private photographs courtesy of NASA and Rick Armstrong. That was a nice photo. Collins was smiling on that. That's all the families together, which I think is a lovely shot. That was the time when Neil Armstrong had crashed that module test and gone home and sat in his office and did a little bit of work, as if nothing had happened. That was the 2 nights before, planning. I still say, why were they looking at maps and stuff? I mean, 2 nights before. Now you're in quarantine and all sorts for 6 months before you go to space. They're 2 days before, they're sitting around at Neil's house, having a cup of tea and looking at some maps. Well, actually, they were having a whiskey afterwards before they went. And there's Neil Armstrong's wife. She wasn't allowed to join in. She had to sit on the outside. Michael Collins, he took his kids on a bike ride before he went. Neil having his breakfast the day before at home. I don't know what that is. Looks a huge egg. Ostrich egg or something. And Michael Collins decided to do a bit of painting as well. And not many photographs of the Aldrin family, so I think this is one of the only ones, other than the one where they're all together, that we've got. And that was the families watching the landings. That was Buzz Aldrin's wife reading about it in the newspaper the day that they landed. And that was Jim Lovell when he came, Michael Collins when they came back having breakfast with his wife. The wives down at NASA. Buzz Aldrin's wife getting very excited that they've landed. And Jim Lovell congratulating Neil Armstrong's wife. And he's probably secretly thinking there, I'm not going to congratulate too much, I never got to go. But at that point he thought he was still going because Apollo 13 hadn't gone. And one of the most, I think, nicest pictures, just before they went to the moon, Rick was complaining to his dad, Daddy says, you never take me camping, you never take me anywhere, you're always busy. And I can imagine this conversation in your house. Look, son, when you come back from the moon, I'll take you. And he did. There he is. So I think that's a lovely picture of Neil taking his son camping after he come back from the moon. On some unsung heroes, NASA operator Gene Kranz, Chris Kraft, NASA flight director, and not recognised till recently, the lady, or the young girl at the time, who wrote the computer program that put them on the moon. Now, they didn't honour women in those days like they do now, so she's recently got the accolade and the recognition she deserves. Neil Armstrong, after going to the moon, he made a trip. Does anybody realise he came to Shrewsbury? No, he did. He came to Shrewsbury because he had to change trains at Shrewsbury and he had to wait an hour. He went to Paolo's restaurant and had a meal, because Paolo's was about then, in 1969. And he also, I don't know the name of the clock shop, but he also went to a clock shop in Shrewsbury to look at some clocks. The guy who owned the clock shop said, I've been struggling to fix this clock for years, and Neil fixed it for him. He hadn't got a clue who he was till he'd gone, and he thought, I'm sure that was Neil Armstrong, because he came here under an assumed name. He jumped on the train to go to York, changed at York, and people started to recognise that Neil Armstrong's on the train to York, and he was heading for Langholm in Scotland, where he wanted to find his ancestors. So he arrived in Langholm in Scotland, They gave him the freedom of the borough. By the time he got there, he wanted to do it all quietly, but he got there. They gave him the freedom of the borough and erected a plaque to him. Now, you would think if Neil Armstrong, the man who landed on the moon, came to your village and recognised and given the freedom of the borough, you would erect a massive plaque and there'd be all sorts going on, touristy stuff and everything. Not at all. It's outside the public toilets on the car park in London. And that's it. That's all they did. Neil Armstrong was also a massive, massive fan of rock music. And there he is. And that, believe it or not, is in Chester with the band Marillion. He came over to see them. And it wasn't long after that that he died. Last year, well this year, but we did this last year, but it was to commemorate this year, the Lord Mayor of London, at the time Peter Estlin and his wife, and the Royal Livery Card Company, the Queen's Royal Livery Card Company, decided to honour Neil Armstrong and the astronauts by producing a royal pack of cards. They do this every year and they have to have a theme. It started by Charles I, and they produced by this order this royal pack of cards, and it was going to be the moon landings. So I received an email that said, you are cordially invited to speak at Mansion House at the Lord Mayor's banquet on the moon landings. And I thought it was spam. I thought, what? So I kind of was a bit sceptical, but actually it was true. And there I am, giving the talk, sitting on the Queen's throne in the Mansion House, giving a talk to 400 dignitaries who'd all paid £1,000 a ticket to go to this. All the money went to charity on the moon landings for 7 minutes. It was the most daunting 7 minutes, I have to say, of my life. But it was probably the only time you'll ever see me dressed up as well. But I had to write something poignant at the end of the talk, because it's a 7-minute talk, there's no slides, it's an after-dinner talk, so I had to write something poignant. So what I wrote was, we cannot, as a species, agree politically, but we can work above the atmosphere in harmony as scientists of the Earth on the International Space Station. I hope we can look forward to the collaboration of nations, working together to strive forward, to venture to the stars, and at the same time preserve our only home. When we do this, we as a race are capable of great things. We are all one race, one species, the human race, tenants of this wonderful blue marble in space, Mother Earth. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions?
It's nothing to do with the climate change at all. It's to do with centrifugal force. If you think about it, we look at things from our perspective in our lifetime. Everything seems to be moving so slow. But in reality, in space terms, we're only here for a microcosm of a second, and everything's spinning like this, so things do spin away. And it's just to do with gravitational force. It's nothing to do with climate change.
But I thought the moon affected our tides.
It affects the tides, but the 4 centimetres it's been moving is not significant. When it's moved several hundred or thousand miles away, we will notice a difference. What's affecting our climate is us, directly, but all we're doing, climate change is inevitable because the sun changes. And we were talking about I was talking about doing a talk on how the sun works. But the sun changes. The sun is changing all the time. And the sun is actually heating up. You might think that's odd that it's caused climate change, but when the sun heats up, it changes the way space weather works. I'm not going to go into the physics of that now, but it will, the Earth's climate will change and the rest of it. But what we're doing is accelerating that. And if you look at the planet Venus, that's happened on Venus, not by the interaction of humans, because there's no humans on Venus, But because more carbon dioxide is being produced by the volcanoes on Venus and the sun's heating up, the carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere, causes a cloud layer around Venus. That gets hotter, which causes more carbon dioxide, which all causes a thicker cloud. And now on Venus, the temperature, probably when the Earth was forming, the temperature on Venus was probably comparable to here. Now it's 436 degrees C, and the pressure of the clouds is so great it'll squash you like a pizza. I'm not going into the physics of that now, but there is a lot of physics behind it. But
Any other questions?
Yeah, I got one. It come up in a quiz that there was 12 people who, up to date, landed on, walked on the moon. Who's the others then?
without going through the slides, there's
Is it true then?
there's Conrad, I'd have to go through the slides, but there are 12. Because there was Apollo 12, 14, obviously not 13, 15, 16 and 17. There was going to be Apollo 18, 19 and 20, but they cut the funding. But there are 12 people who walked on the moon.
Apparently NASA is planning to be back on the moon by 2024. Are your hopes in the next 10 years for getting more people on the moon?
I think we need to get people on the moon. Number one is we're mining the Earth, we're looking for minerals on the Earth, and that's destroying the Earth as we know. If we can get people on the moon to look for minerals on the moon, we can mine the moon, that's not going to have an effect on us. There's another reason, I'm hoping that we're back to the moon before that. The Chinese have already got rovers running about the back end of the moon as we speak, on both sides. There's this side and the other side, and the Russians are sending stuff up. But we need to work together to do this. One of the projects that was put together in 2001 to put a ring of solar panels around the moon and beam back the energy via microwave. This technology is there to do now, but the oil companies blocked it. It will give free energy to the Earth forever. And that has actually been, if you go onto the internet, if you Google it, the solar panel plan, all the plans are there and it can be done. But the oil companies block it. And of course, a lot of the oil companies and a lot of the big companies are the ones that invest and put money into the space program. And they would withdraw their funding if we were going to do that. But I'm hoping we're back there soon. We need it also, if we want to go to Mars, we can't launch a spacecraft from Earth to Mars. We haven't got the technology to create a thrust big enough to push a manned spacecraft to Mars. But you can from the moon because you need less thrust. So it also will be a staging post to get further out. Also for doing space research, we use telescopes on Earth, but the weather, as somebody mentioned, climate change is causing lots of problems with the weather. So ground-based telescopes can't operate that often. We put the Hubble in orbit, but that's coming to the end of its life. It would be great to be able to put space telescopes on the far side of the moon. No weather, no problems, no light pollution. And away you go. So I want to go back to the moon tomorrow. Be much better for us.
I was just interested, there's a lot of stuff floating around in space, and I believe there was a program to get it back from space. So how do they do it?
I think it's Elon Musk again. He's looking at a program where you're taking spacecraft up with nets, and they grab the small debris with nets. But what do you do with it then? You're just bringing it back here. We're just bringing all the junk back here. So it's got to be disposed of some way. And I think the only way, probably far off into the future, they'll grab all this space debris and they'll take it into orbit around somewhere like Venus and dump it on Venus because there's nothing there. So we're just looking for another landfill site in space. Because that's what one scientist always said. I think it was Stephen Hawking said, the Earth is a beautiful marble in space, he said. And he said, and it's there, and it's self-sustaining. He said, but it's got a virus on it. And that's us. And he's kind of right, isn't he, really?